There it is.
Love it.
I feel like Memphis in May. Just a couple more days. That weekend would be here. Memphis in May. Woohoo! Blues Festival.
Really blow out my little microphone speaker here.
Nope, you sound good. If you want to go ahead and share your screen, you've got one more minute.
I need to do that. Let me get her up here. There it is. Share screen. Now, there. Come on. Oh. There we go. And I can make it bigger. Doing this through PDFs these days, it seems to be working better on my laptop than the PowerPoint did. Open
Whatever
Office.
works for you.
Yeah, this will work. This will work.
Well, you're still having people come in, and Lindy put your presentation and handouts for today on the website.
Oh,
so you're set to go there.
I just want to remind you all that I'll be watching the Zoom chat if you all want to type comments to him, and Leah's going to be watching the participants for raised hands, and we'll go ahead and let Ken get started.
Okay. We're going to be doing architecture today. This is usually the first class I do when I do my part 2 of my 8 weeks classes. So this would actually be class number 9, but I move things around a lot. Usually people always ask me to do a little more on perspective. So this will be kind of a quick overview of mostly 2-point perspective, and a little on sketching before we get into more details of sketching architecture. I've got a couple of talks on that where we'll get into easier ways to do it so you can draw buildings and things much more quickly and accurately with a lot less trouble than people sometimes have. There it is. Find my button here. There we go. Some good books. Those of you that had my class at LifeQuest last time, I talked about a couple of these books, several more actually. And these are some really good books for perspective. They show you just a simple overview of it without getting into a lot of details, but give you all the perspective that you need to draw about anything really. The one that on the right there that says just for fun perspective, that's really not the original title, which I believe was in French, but they changed it to this. And actually, more than half of the book is on composition, and it's really, really good on that. Shows you a lot of simple things you can do with color and things like that. And I really like it. I've enjoyed it. There's good sketches in it, and it makes it a really good book. And all these urban sketching handbooks are pretty good. They're rather general, but they give you a lot of views of different people's artwork. And this one by Stephanie Bauer is one of the better ones, I think. So where to start? If you're new to architectural drawing, I'd start with a small building. Barns, outhouses are good. You can see that little shed down there at the bottom that I drew. I actually did that during an art class from the Artists League of Arkansas here. They were doing a watercolor class from a gentleman from Colorado, I believe. And I just kind of painted along with it and did whatever he was suggesting with my little outhouse to make that painting. But sheds, small homes, even a small home can be daunting for some people that haven't have much experience with perspective. Storefronts are good too. So talk about that. Lots of people like to draw barns. I think mostly because they have a lot of character when they're old and falling apart. We have a lot in Arkansas. I always make it a habit of stopping and taking a quick photo of any barn I run across that looks interesting, and a lot of times I'll draw it later on. Portions of a building are sometimes a lot easier to do than the whole building, and you'll get the interesting parts. A lot of times, a lot of the building is not very interesting. So, you know, why draw it? Why paint it? Get the parts you like. And you may not have time too. So, like on this particular images here, the one on the far left, that's the History Museum downtown, of course. And I just drew one very tight corner of it looking up, and filled 2 pages with that. So you don't have to do the whole building all the time. Same with this Rock Island Depot. I thought the interesting part was there in the center. That's at Perry, Arkansas. I think they moved that building now. I haven't been there in a while, but they were talking about moving it down the street a few hundred yards and turning it into a museum. It looks to me like from that drawing, they've got a lot of work to do. So who knows on that? And then, of course, the Little Rock Arsenal Tower building there, just the center of that. I've drawn that building a number of times. Towers are good. Towers are usually really interesting architecturally. They have a lot on them, and yet they're small, so you can do them fairly quickly. A lot of times you're looking up, so you get a lot of interesting perspectives. Not always on those. In fact, on those first 3 there, those large pictures, I was more or less level each time. I was standing on a high wall for the first one. I was on a hill for the one at Hot Springs, looking across at the Arlington Hotel. And then I think I was at the library or somewhere sketching that picture of the river market. I know it looks like my eye level is just pretty much up there even with that. That must have been where I was. Whereas that bottom little tower sketch, you can tell I was looking up at that crow on top of the little towers. So towers are really good. I don't know how many towers I painted. I did one the other night. Just find them interesting to do, and I can do one pretty quickly. So you got 20 minutes before bedtime. You can pull out your sleepy time, bedtime sketchbook and draw a little tower or something. Signs are really great too. I keep an eye out for interesting commercial signs. They're fun to draw. These are a couple that were in the Highlands in Scotland, and they were very interesting there. Applejack's had that skeleton on a bicycle. They put it up, they said one Halloween as part of their Halloween decorations, and everybody in town liked it so much they left it. It's always there now. And then the Tasty Fry fish, I thought that was good too. Now that place really smelled like a greasy fish and chips place, I tell you. You can just do details. That's another good place to start. I got there down at the bottom left. That was on the top of a cathedral tower you could step out onto, and a little platform to view. The one above there, that door latch, was actually from Crystal Bridges Museum's Arts and Crafts traveling exhibit that they had. And I think that was a door latch from 17 or 1800, somewhere in there. And I did that one in colored pencil. I do colored pencils occasionally. The one in the middle is from the train station. That's one of the decorative motifs around a fountain by their front door. And it made a good sketch in colored pencil, I thought. The lamp on the far right, that's from downtown Little Rock. I think it's probably on 4th Street, if I'm correct, or 3rd maybe. I think 4th. And just on one of the buildings, and they had several different lights like that. Many with different styles, actually. So that was good. And that works well on a tone paper. You can use white, which you don't often get to do if you're doing watercolor unless you're using some white gouache. So I like to use the tone paper occasionally. And this is Strathmore. They're toned sketchbooks. And they'll take a little watercolor. They're not great with watercolor at all. But you can put a little dry wash on them. It's okay. So as a review, those of you who've had my class before know this, but some questions asked before you begin to sketch. You know, what caught your attention? Why did you want to sketch this in the first place? You probably want to think about that, and that's definitely going to be your focal point, your center of interest in your sketch. Take time to walk around if you can and get the best view. Sometimes you'll find that if you just move over even a few feet, you'll have a better sketch than if you just started drawing immediately what you saw. So take a look around, and also think about safety. It's real easy to get excited about what you're doing and not think about traffic and being in the way of other people. And also just, are you in a good part of town? Do you need to watch out? You know, do you know where you are? If you're traveling, you may not know. And so it's a good idea to kind of take these things into consideration, look around, see what's going on before you jump into your sketching. Because once you start, if you're like me, everything else just disappears and somebody could walk up right behind you and you'd never know it. I wouldn't. And so I try and sketch with a building to my back, just lean up against a building. It's more comfortable for me that way anyway. The next thing you want to know about your sketching, this thing you're going to sketch, is, does it elicit any emotions in you? How does it make you feel? Just thinking about that will actually influence the way you draw, the way you paint it. You might think of colors that match the mood this particular architectural subject might elicit in you. So it's a good idea to just kind of check that. And even if you just say, well, it doesn't make me feel like anything, well, you know, that's something, at least you've thought about it. So something excited you about it, or you wouldn't have done it. So, and another really big thing is, how much time do you have to draw? You know, so often we're rushed, and it seems like there's never enough time. And so you may want to not draw something quite as large as you have in mind. Anything that's twice as large will have 4 times the surface area to cover. And so you can see that can really add up. And for me, an 8.5 by 11 page, if I'm really doing a lot of sketching on it, that's a 2-hour sketch with watercolor on it. Smaller ones I can do much quicker, or just partial page or something. But if I'm really filling up a page, it's going to take about that in general for me to get anything down the way I like. Thumbnail sketches are very valuable, and it really helps to do them. And yet I find, especially if I'm out sketching somewhere, I never do it. Just taking up that much more time, but you will come up with a better composition generally, or at least think about what you're doing and arrange it in a pleasing manner when you do that. There's just some examples there of some thumbnails I did. And this little painting, actually, that those thumbnails are from, I did at home and I wasn't rushed. And I was doing it from an old newspaper photograph. So makes a lot of difference. But again, if you're rushed for time, it's kind of a luxury to do thumbnails for me. A lot of people are quicker than I am, though. Look for large shapes when you draw really anything. Start with the large shapes. Generally will make it easier for you. It's a little different if you're going directly with pen and ink, which a lot of us do. Then you're doing contour drawings. You can, do a more constructed drawing, and your ink lines will kind of disappear, but I tend to just do contour when I'm doing ink. And it gets a little shaky sometimes, but that's just part of the drawing, and that's okay. But notice here on the old state house, look at all the geometric shapes. We've got that big triangular pediment up there, the circle of the medallion in the center of it. We have cylinders, columns, and big rectangles and squares. It's a very geometric building, and so it's not a lot of complex curves and things like that. You can really lay this out fairly quickly. Good building to practice drawing on, and there's lots of nice shade and good places to sit there. Great place to go for sketching. If you want to avoid perspective problems and you're just starting out, try some no perspective sketches. These are often called elevations, or Actually, these are what I would call one-point perspective, even though you really don't have any converging lines to speak of on this. I see in this sketch I made, I see two converging lines, one up on the far left at the top of the chimney, and on that same part of the building, the roof line is going to a vanishing point. And to be honest, I'm not sure if I got that really exactly right. But you don't have to. You have to just get believably close. You can measure all of these out, but when you're sketching, and in most paintings, you can be off a bit and it won't be noticeable. I'll show you some examples here in a bit. Now, we've added depth to this painting here I have by several devices, and since we don't have the dimensionality you'd get with perspective, we have a foreground there, kind of light foreground because all the sheep are mostly white. So we got a white sheep foreground. We've got a middle ground there that's the building, and that's actually the focus of the sketch with the most color and contrast. And then we have a background that's a little darker and subdued. And so we do have depth created by those three parts of our sketch. And something to think about whenever you're doing a sketch or painting is to add that depth with a foreground, middle ground, and background as sort of a beginning place to look at what you're doing. You can add multiple layers even in those. Elevation sketch, no perspective, straight on. Here's kind of an example. And as starting a sketch, estimate the height on your page so that you don't get a lot drawn and then find out that, oh, it's really not going to fit on the page. I've had that happen before. I was doing a church one time and had a really tall steeple, and I just had to put that steeple on the page above it because it just did not fit like I thought it would. And I'd gotten everything else drawn. So you want to try and avoid that and kind of plan those out real quick. You can do a really, really loose, quick drawing in light pencil and pretty well tell if something's going to fit on the page within just really 1 or 2 minutes at most. So that's a good thing to do like that. Always begin your sketches with a vertical line. If it's in 2-point perspective, you'd want the corner of the building closest to you as an example, and I'll show you some of those. But that's a good way to start because you really don't have to get the length of the line correct. A lot of times I'll draw that first vertical line from wherever it starts to the bottom of the page, and then I'll just erase part of it when I get down to where it is and where I know the length ought to be. So these verticals, all of the verticals can be done that way and will save you a lot of time, and you can get them in quicker when you do that. If you're doing it with ink, well, you just kind of have to do your best and adjust it. If you need to lengthen it, it's probably best to leave it a little short than it is to get it too long, but you can work it out pretty well once you're used to doing that anyway. With any building, I look for squares to begin with. If there's square things there, that really helps. I can draw a square easier than I can draw a rectangle because you know, a square is equal sides, so you don't have to say, well, is that rectangle twice as long as it is wide or anything like that. You can just put that square down. And another thing you can do is even on a rectangle, put a square there and then look at what you're drawing and say, well, how much farther out from that square does that go? So another good way to estimate what you're doing there, getting those proportions. And you need all the help you can getting proportions accurate. You get the proportions down, you know, work lightly and get those as close as you can because that's going to be the most important part of your painting or sketch. It won't look right if that initial underdrawing is wrong. No matter how well you paint, you can't make up for a wrong drawing. So those first few minutes are really the most important thing you can do as far as making any kind of a sketch or a painting. So we're finding our squares. Try and get those outside proportions first, the larger shapes. Sometimes I have to work my way across. An example, say that top row of windows up there, I have a hard time seeing a long horizontal length. So I might look at the length between the wall and the first window. Then I would see the length of all those windows there, and probably go across, and I could make those little spaces between windows pretty easily, and notice that between the first two, there's a larger gap than there are between each pair. And then notice the distance from the last window to the wall again. And that's one way to get a width on there. Sometimes that works better for some people than trying to get the overall general shape all at once. So try different things to see what will work for you. But in general, the bigger shapes you can get to begin with, the better off you're going to be. So then you can divide up those outside proportions by what you already have down. On an elevation sketch, most of the lines are going to be vertical and horizontal, and that really helps things out if you're just learning to do these. Estimating angles is a part of two-point perspective, and a lot harder to do for people than exactly vertical or horizontal lines. So again, this is a good way to start building sketching. You kind of make in any sketch, I suggest making a kind of a structural grid in your head. Some people will draw it right out on the paper, very much like these red lines that you see. But what you want to look at is, let's take, to begin with, right above the doorway on the blue building, you'll see that long, dark bar there. And you just kind of measure and look across. Where does that intersect? And well, if you go onto the beige-looking building, it intersects at the bottom of that window frame. So you know that you're going to have to put your bottom of your window frame even with that dark shadow bar on that blue building. The same up there, say you go between that big white bar between the sets of windows, and you notice that it comes to about a third of the way across the windows on the beige building. And so you want that to work like that. What do we have up here? The roof line of the beige building will come just below the upper windows, clerestory windows up there, dormers, on the roof of the blue building. And so we look at all of these relationships, and it makes our drawing all come together when we do that. Another thing to consider is, notice chimney on the left is taller than the chimney on the right by a little bit. You want to make note of these things. And looking at spaces between the chimney and the dormers, the space between the dormers. Notice those dormers are essentially squares. You could draw a square there, put that little arc over the top, and you've got the dormer done. So again, looking for those squares. The window on the beige building there is a nice square. So lots can be done with that, and this could be quickly drawn because of that. Now let's take a look at the roof lines on this. It's something to consider, even in an elevation sketch or one-point perspective like this. Notice how those roof lines are angling. They will all meet at a vanishing point directly above you. Wherever your viewpoint is, wherever you're standing or sketching, the vanishing point is going to be directly above your head. Even though you're looking straight on at the object and not doing two-point perspective, you do have a perspective point and a vanishing point way up there in the sky somewhere on these. And so you want to take advantage of that and know that the left-hand side of that roof is going to slope inward just a bit, and the right-hand side is going to slope inward just a bit. If you make them totally straight, you really wouldn't be drawing what you saw from there. Another thing to keep in mind is these buildings do not have to be exactly proportioned, just believable. For one thing, nobody else knows what that building looks like except you that was drawing it, unless it's like the Eiffel Tower or something like that, that everybody knows what it looks like. So, you know, if you're close, you're doing well on that. And here's an example of one I did. This is in Stirling Castle in Scotland. Notice how I gave it some depth with a foreground, midground, and a little bit of background. I put very little background into that. But I didn't paint everything. I painted what I wanted people to look at. And so I left the foreground people unpainted, even though we do have a good compositional device of the man in the foreground pointing up to the building at something. So that kind of leads the eye into wherever he's pointing, and have people to look at, and then the color will attract our eye immediately, and of course the emphasis is on that building. And notice how your eye goes to those doors, because we have the greatest contrast in the shadow areas of those two doors, and so you're immediately drawn to that because of the contrast. And again, just a hint of a background, but it adds depth. And notice even in that background, actually there's about 3 layers. We have the trees, that little hint in between the two buildings. We have birds, and then we have the sky. So we have 3 levels of background depth in that small space. So 2-point perspective, a little different. Here we are at Hot Springs. We're looking at the Ozark Bass and wondering, how are we going to sketch this? And this was a hot day, if I remember right, even though I did that in April. Still, it was a hot day, I remember that. So here we are looking at it. We got a lot going on there, and I'll show you how I would start it and do the sketch. I begin finding my eye level. That's always the first thing you want to know, is where is the eye level? Look for horizontal lines. If the line is sloping, like say the roof of that building, obviously that's not your eye level. Eye level, the line will be horizontal. See, we're getting closer with that bottom line on the building. It's only sloping upwards gently. So any line that's sloping up is going to be below eye level, and any of the lines like the roof sloping down are going to be above eye level. And you can use a lot of visual cues too. Usually if you're standing at a doorway, the eye level, and you're standing, the eye level will be, you know, just above the door handles, up about, you know, couple of feet above door handle will get you pretty close to eye level. Look at other people. If it's level, you can put eye level by noticing where other people's heads are. That's another good way to do it. Look for level lines in brickwork and stonework. That works well too. But you gotta find that eye level if you're gonna get your perspective right. Then you want to estimate how much room you've got on the page. Some buildings, the height is more important. If you're wanting to get the whole building in like this, well then sometimes the width is important as well. If you're wanting to do an entire building portrait. Even on this building, I left a bit out over on the right-hand side, I believe. So kind of guess at that. So make sure things fit. Then we're going to start with that vertical line. And like I say, I always start on the closest corner. That's usually the tallest, longest line. And so I'll do that. And I'll look at that highest point on the building and start marking off some lines. Look at the halfway mark. That looks like halfway down there comes right on that roof line there on the 3rd mark from the top of the building. And that's a good one to know, is halfway there. And then estimating the others. If you estimate the height of the tower, you can kind of count how many towers tall that building is. And it looks to be about 2.5, 2.25, somewhere in there. Then we can start looking more at perspective lines themselves. We've got some important information down already. The first line I want is the one that's got the most angle to it, and that'll be the top line up there on the tower. Now, you can see I didn't lay this sketch out with a ruler. If I had of, that top line on the 2nd tower farther back would have been in line with the first one, because they're in a line in the same plane. And I was off a little, but most people would never know that if I didn't say so. So you can be off a bit. And I was off actually quite a bit in that 2nd one on the back tower. I wasn't giving it the consideration it should have gotten. So that's the way these things go sometimes. Now I'm really interested in that first line that goes from the top of my vertical down the roof line of that building. That's really an important one to get there. And I'm pretty careful about getting that angle correct. And if you'll notice, the higher up you go, the steeper the angles get. The closer you get to that eye level line, the flatter they get. If you go against that rule, it's going to look wrong. Just like in the top, that tower in the back, in the distance there, if you'll look at that second line there, it is definitely off. And once you know what to look for, you can tell that. It ought to have more slope to it. So each progressive level on that building should get closer and closer to the eye level flat horizon line. And just the opposite when you start at ground level. Well, you're still going to get more and more horizontal and level as you go up to eye level. But as you go down, of course, it'll get a steeper angle. The thing is, when you're viewing a building, you're usually pretty close to ground level. And so you're not going to see much angle there at the bottom of the building. But it's usually there. So some tips. Use a straight edge to speed up your initial layout and some very light lines. It's not cheating. A lot of the very best artists I know will use a straight edge, especially lay out just a few perspective lines, just to have something to work from. The eye level line in your vertical, and then get in some perspective lines off of that vertical, and you're well on your way to getting an accurate sketch when you can do that. With ink, I use dots a lot of times to get those lined up, rather than drawing in perspective lines. I'll put an ink dot on the vertical and then an ink dot on where I think that angle is, and use that. Sometimes I'll draw it in with a pencil, but generally I'll just draw the line I'm making straight in, and not really use a ruler at all when I'm doing ink. I like a 6 to 12 inch ruler. 6 inch fits my bag better and fits most of my sketches fine. I like it transparent so I can see my work underneath it. It's easier to line things up. And it's also easier to hold it up and just look at things. Looking at an angle of a building, if you can see through the ruler, it doesn't block everything. So I really like those better. You can use a light graphite pencil. If you're doing watercolor, you can also use kind of a neutral colored watercolor pencil, and it'll just blend right in with your watercolor if you're very light with it. And you won't have to worry about that as you paint. Or you can use a blue col erase pencil. A lot of people really like these. In bright light, I have a hard time seeing them, especially if it's next to a dark line, which can be so much contrast on your eye on the black versus white paper that you don't see the blue. It just blends in with the white. So I have a bit of trouble with those. I find the Verithin, Prismacolor Verithin cerulean blue actually is just a tad darker and works just well. It doesn't erase as well, but it doesn't, you draw right over it anyway, so it's not going to show up. And then you can freehand draw over everything after you've got your lines in lightly. Don't use a ruler to make your permanent lines if you're wanting a nice, loose, free-feeling sketch. If you use the ruler, it's going to look like you did it on a drafting table, and it will really feel out of place if you've used your ruler in some places, but not in others, to make really hard, straight lines. So just put those lines in faintly with your ruler, and then go back over them with your hand. You'll be close enough. And if you get all kinds of wavy lines doing that, as long as you end up at about the right spot, it'll look good. So here we are, we're lining up windows next. And notice I put that line through there and lined all my windows up along that were in a line. That saves you a lot of time. You can do that at the tops and bottoms of the windows. And realize that, the angles are going to be slightly different, especially if it's a long, tall window. The bottom part of that window will be angled less than the top window ledges will be. We'll look at some pictures of that. So here we are. I'm putting in lines, and I'm only putting in lines where it's useful. You don't have to put in a whole series like every inch or every quarter inch or anything like that. and line things up. Just kind of put them where it's useful each time. Window levels, roof lines, things like that. Now our landscape we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, this is where it comes in. We start putting in those landscape elements and using them to best advantage. Notice I used a really heavy dark blue sky in this one because I wanted a dark sky to contrast with the white building to really make the building come out. I guess if I had wanted it really to pop out, I could have made a storm cloud behind it, but it wasn't a stormy day. And I wanted this to be very cheerful, bright sort of thing going on. Oh my, we're running out of time. I have been talking so much. But again, our landscape elements really come into forefront there. We're going to reduce our detail in the background, simplify our tones, push lights and darks. Even if they're not that dark, when you can get some contrast like that, you can really use that to your advantage to draw the eye where you want it. Put your detail up there close, but don't overdo it. You really don't need a lot of detail. Color is going to come last, and remember, color won't make up for a bad sketch. Get a good sketch to begin with. Bases of buildings often have vegetation and things like that at the bottom, and this is a good thing because then you don't have to worry about the perspective along the bottom at all, and you can make the vegetation pretty well cover up all of that. So you're really concerned with the lines, the roof lines generally, and that will speed you along as well. Street views, again, you get generally a 1-point perspective on these. You'll notice the top of those buildings at Hot Springs sloping down to a vanishing point, and the street is sloping up to a vanishing point. Your eye level would be right on those heads that you see across the street of those people. That's your eye line, and the vanishing point will be somewhere on that eye level line always, wherever those sloping lines meet, going up and down. And again, you don't have to find that vanishing point. Just know it's out there and kind of generally aim so that they'll meet on the horizon line. There's another elevation sketch. As you can see, much easier. The only slopes on that sketch, the horizontal and vertical, are that peaked roof. So, pretty quick, easy sketch to do. Another street view. Notice I made a mistake on that big building in the near foreground on the left. Its vanishing point's quite a bit higher than the rest. You wouldn't notice that if I took off that red line. It's not far enough off to matter. If you're in the general area there, it's just fine. So don't have to worry about that. Again, watch out sketching on the sidewalk. You can get run over. That's people out walking. You don't always see the vanishing point at all. These are just a couple of sketches to show you that it's somewhere off the page. And yet we're doing the same thing. We've got an eye level with that person on the left-hand side painting there. And notice how the window are pretty level right through there. That little window mullion across on both of those windows, horizontal because it's right down there on the eye level line. And as they get higher up, you get more and more slope. And, you get the same with that other sketch on the other side. All sloping to the eye level line, which are those two people standing by that white building there, would be going right to their heads. You can get some strange things looking downhill. Your eye level line is a lot of times above the house if the hill's steep enough. So even though you're drawing a picture of a street going downhill, notice that the bottoms of those houses are sloping up, and that can really confuse you. You really need to hold up a ruler and look and see what the angle is, because you'll think you're going to be drawing a line going straight down with the hill, but you're not. It's going to go up to your eye level line, and can cause a lot of confusion when you're starting to draw. People going uphill are going to be higher on the page, and they're going to be smaller as they progress up there. Perspective lines, again, are going to be a little odd. So you need to really make sure you know where your eye level line is and look at where those buildings are sloping, roof lines particularly, but also the street level lines too, because they're going up a hill and that's going to change the way that looks. And also, we tend to raise our heads up. And so we're changing what we think is our eye level view. So recognize that and try and avoid it. Here's some skyline views. Really reduce your detail and move buildings around. Feel free to move buildings a little closer together if it makes a better composition, and leave some out if they're not important to the composition. Things like that. Closer, more detail as you get closer. That building on the right there was taken from, I think, 5th floor of the library downtown. And so the detail is in the history museum across the street. And then as we get further out, there's less and less detail going on. Sometimes you get architecture like this at Crystal Bridges, and you just kind of have to do the best you can. Kind of start with the box sometimes. That will help and fit that structure into a box. It just takes a lot of careful observation, getting some of those complex curves. If you can get those right, you're off. Something like that, you can just start drawing and see how it works out. But you do see some perspective, even in those big concrete blocks there, that can be helpful too. So I've got this actually on my handouts where you can draw a barn, squint and look at that tone. That's the first thing you want to do. Make a quick line drawing. I did all of this, I think, in Adobe Illustrator or something, just threw some lines down here. Then we put in our tone. The most important part is thinking about that. And that's where thumbnails come in, because you can change this tone to suit your sketch. You know, you can move that sunlight anywhere you want. And then color is last. And here's an example in watercolor of that barn. Notice how I made the vegetation in front of the door light so it would contrast more with that dark interior. I really made the barn wood, especially above that dark spot, sunlit and very light. So again, we get contrast between those openings and the side of the barn. I probably could have made that barn side on the left over, right side over there a little darker, but I was wanting again to get contrast with the trees behind it. And so tonally, I made it a little lighter and made the trees a little darker like that. And with trees, vegetation, I use them to suit my composition, not what's actually there always. I'll use them as a suggestion. Notice there were some roses in that picture. Well, I put a little bit of rose in there along a fence line. I made that road there. I put a mailbox. I don't know why a barn needs a mailbox, but that one's got a mailbox. That's for the cows. Yeah. They have pen pals. They're cow pen. So, anyway. So there we have it. Try some of these out. On your handouts today, I've got some things you can draw. I've also got a handout on what makes a good sketch. For those of you that haven't had my class, just several points to consider whenever you're sketching. And also there's a new PDF on sketch artist materials. I've got about 6 pages there of materials with photographs of things and my comments on them for what they're worth. And you can download those and see what you think about those too. And that's all I have this week. We're out of time, I'm sure. So if there's questions, I'm here if we have time for questions.
If you want to stop sharing your screen and maybe do a gallery view, then you can see everybody.
Oh, okay.
We did have a question in the chat earlier, but a few slides later you answered it, and so they were happy. So we'll just kind of see if anybody else has questions.
Oh, great. I've totally explained everything.
Feedback for Ken.
Yeah.
Y'all could feel free to unmute yourselves to ask a question or give Ken some feedback.
Can you tell more about that pencil, that coal? I don't remember what you called it when you were talking about using the blue pencils.
Yeah, Colorase. It's a Prismacolor pencil, and they're erasable.
Okay.
They look like a normal colored pencil, hexagonal barrel. Look like a Verithin. Now they have an eraser on top, and they are erasable, but you don't ever need to erase them. It's so light, the blue one, that it just disappears once you get your drawings made.
But you like the Verithin and blue is what you said you can see?
I like their cerulean blue. For me, it's about the same color as the Colorase. It's just a little bit darker, and I can see it a little better.
Okay.
Especially in bright light. I have a problem with that. It doesn't erase, but it doesn't have to.
Right. Thank you.
Ken, what is tone paper?
Tone paper is just colored. Generally, it's brown and gray, a tan color, and gray with Strathmore, or you can get black, but that's going pretty far. In sheet paper, you can get any tone you want, any color. Blue's nice. I'm using some Strathmore blue right now for some sketches, and really interesting with watercolor. It really gives a dark, sort of stormy feel to things. The color of your paper can really affect the mood of your painting. A nice warm tone will warm up the general overall tone of the picture, provide that unity to it, whereas bluer colors, cooler colors will kind of calm things down, might be a little more somber. You can affect the emotional content of your sketches and paintings by the color of paper you choose.
I see a couple of people that are unmuted. Maybe Joe has a question, or Lynn Smith.
No, I just unmuted to say thank you, Ken.
Sure.
And thank you, Gina.
You're welcome.
Good class.
We'd love to see your art. If anybody has it where they can show it up to the camera, if you've been painting on things, or if you want to turn your thing around, I'd love to see examples of what you've been working on while he's been talking.
I know John has one.
Any takers? No takers? They're all flat, too wet to lift up? I don't know.
There goes one. There's John's.
There's John.
Oh, nice.
Good job.
Beautiful. Wow, such talent.
That's awesome. Anybody else?
We could probably put some of those on our Facebook and website too if you want to send us some photos.
Yep, just take a picture of it and email it to us. We'd love to do that.
It makes us look good when y'all do that.
Or if it's a work in progress and you want some constructive criticism from Kenneth, we can pass it on to him. Yeah. I'm sure he'd love to help you with that too.
Sure. Anybody with questions can always email me.
I just want to say that this is great fun. I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, Ken.
All right.
Love it.
Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Love seeing everybody.
Again next week.
See you all.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye.